So what I've done is I've gone and I've done a search for ADFS requirements, and it's brought up a site that's going to allow me to review the current requirements. So what we're going to do is we're going to step out to this site and take a peek at just some of the requirements that we mentioned on the previous slide, so we have an idea as to what we're looking for when we're planning and configuring ADFS. So here we are on the ADFS requirements page. You're seeing here that applies to Windows Server 2012 R2 as well as 2016, even though it's not listed. And you'll see several different categories of requirements here on the right-hand side. We're not going to go through all of these, by the way. But let's go up and take a look at certificate requirements. We'll click on that one first. And it talks about the SSL certificate. It has to be a publicly trusted X509 v3 certificate. You need to use certificates that are issued by Public Third-Party Certification Authority, CA, in production. You can use a self-signed SSL certificate if you want to do so in a test lab. So that's just one of the requirements there. We'll jump over to hardware requirements. CPU speed, 1.4 gigahertz 64-bit processor with a quad-core 2 gigahertz. 512 megabytes of RAM on the minimum. 4 gigs is the recommended. Always go with the recommended, and then I usually double it on top of that. And then we have the 32 gig minimum requirement for disk space with 100 gigs as a recommended requirement. If we go to the software requirements, you're going to see for extranet access, you must deploy the WAP role service. We've talked about that already. And the second requirement is a Federation server and the WAP role service cannot be installed on the same computer. Very, very key for you to understand that. Your Active Directory services requirements, domain controllers and all user domains and the domain that the ADFS server belongs to must be running Windows Server 2008 or later. If you look at the domain functional level requirements, you're going to see that it requires at least Windows Server 2003. Now, you can get away with 2003, but you're going to lose some functionality. So I'm emphasizing the use of a domain functional level of 2008 to make sure you get the full functionality of ADFS. And here it gives you some of the requirements about the WID regarding the number of relying party trust and artifact resolution profile and SAML 2.0 is not supported in these. It also mentions the third one, deploying ADFS servers in distinct data centers for failover or geographic load balancing is supported as long as we don't have any more than 30 servers. So information about the WID. Your browser requirements, so you have 4 requirements here. JavaScript must be enabled. Cookies must be turned on. A lot of people don't like having cookies on. Those have to be turned on. The server name indication, or SNI, must be supported. And for the user certificate and device certificate authentication, which means the workplace join functionality, the browser must also support SSL client certificate authentication. Network requirements. Configuring the corporate firewall, and we've already talked about the need for port 443 and port 49443. Let's jump down to one more. We'll look at the authentication requirements. And under authentication requirements, we have intranet access, and we have extranet access, and we have for certificate authentication requirements here. So make sure you review all 3 of these when planning for ADFS. The workplace join requirements, one last piece here. End users can workplace join devices to an organization using ADFS. Some requirements though. ADFS supports workplace join for Windows 8.1 and iOS 5 Plus devices. To use this functionality, the schema of the forest that ADFS servers are joined to must be Windows Server 2012 R2. That's key right there. Can't do this if we're running Windows Server 2012. The subject alternative name of the SSL certificate for the ADFS service must contain the value enterprise registration, that's all one word, that's followed by the user principal name or UPN suffix of your organization, and it gives you an example here, enterpriseregistration.corp.contoso.com. So highly recommend you visit this site to get additional information regarding the requirements of ADFS. Now that was a lot of information, so I provided a little summary screen for the key deployment considerations. Certificates, X509 version 3. Hardware and software requirements must be met. You saw they were minimal. ADFS and WAP cannot be installed on the same server. Domain controllers 2008 or higher. Domain functional level 2008 or higher for full support. Your ADFS servers must be joined to an ADDS domain. It requires a DNS host or A record of the fully qualified domain name of Federation server. And the extranet access requires a WAP service. We've talked about that a few times. And the workplace join is available if the client is 8.1 or an iOS 5 plus 0, and the 4 schema is 2012 R2. Now, just a little bit on ADFS with MFA, the multi-factor authentication. When we're talking about MFA, we have a two-part configuration. We first need to specify the conditions where MFA may be required. In addition to that, we need to select the additional authentication method that's going to be allowed. Windows Server 2012 R2 has certificate authentication as a secondary authentication method for MFA. MFA settings are conditions that require MFA. Specific users and groups in an Active Directory domain, a registered workplace joined or unregistered not workplace joined devices, and then access requests from intranet versus extranet. These are settings or conditions that require MFA. You can create custom authentication methods in addition to the normal ones you use for MFA, and there are additional authentication methods that can be Microsoft-based or third-party vendors. Now, when we talk about third-party vendors, we have about a half a dozen or so that you can look at. I don't even know how to pronounce some of these. Gemalto, HDI Global, InWebo or InWebo, Login People MFA, RSA Secure ID, SafeNet, Swisscom, and Symantec are some of these third-party MFA vendors that support ADFS with Microsoft. And the last topic I want to discuss are claims rules, and they govern the decision in regards of the claims that ADFS issues, what it's going to allow. Claims rules and all server configuration data are stored in your ADFS configuration database, whether it be a WID or a SQL server. So a few of these to be aware of: filter incoming claims, permit all users if we don't want to restrict anyone or have any filtering, ADFS 1.x compatible claim, group membership as a claim, permit or deny incoming claim, send claims using custom rule, transfer incoming claim, send authentication method claim, and then send LDAP attributes as claims. So all of these can be used as options when we're trying to configure and manage our claims rules. So in this module, we went through quite a bit. We provided an ADFS overview. We looked at things to take into considerations when planning for ADFS. We talked about the ADFS requirements. We talked about how to configure ADFS with MFA and some of the options and requirements around MFA. And we wrapped it up by talking about some of the claims rules or filters that we can use with ADFS. Next up, we're going to look at the installation and management of ADFS.